Okay, so our quick overview of the webinar is about 45 minutes of a presentation or so from Garry. The webinar is recorded and will be available after the fact once we edit it. It is also being live streamed to our Hunters for BC Facebook group. We just want to stay upfront based on a little bit of our social media activity. We recognize that change in our forestry and resource sector affects real lives and real people. This is not an anti-forestry webinar. We will ask that you keep your language in a professional tone as you dialogue with our presenter at the end. So what I will be doing is, for my participants, put your questions in the Q&A section. You'll see an icon at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring the Q&A for your questions, and in the order that you send them, your Zoom profile will be changed from attendee to presenter. So we ask whenever possible that you have both your audio and your video turned on for face-to-face discussion with Garry when we get to that question mark or question time. We ask that you be considerate too of the time that we have allotted, which is 90 minutes or so. We do expect to have a lot of questions to get through this evening. Now we have Neil Findlay is our director. He is hopefully going to be able to co-host. He is working remotely and his Wi-Fi isn't cooperating all that well, so he may jump in and out. Neil is a registered professional forester from the Kamloops area with over 35 years experience in the forest industry. Hence one of the reasons that we chose him to co-host tonight. Self-employed consultant for the majority of his career, he is a generalist with extensive experience in planning, forest operations, silviculture, and protection. He grew up on a cattle ranch in the Okanagan and has done stints as a trapper as well as a guide outfitter. He has a Bachelor of Science in Forestry from UBC with a minor in wildlife management. He considers himself a hunter conservationist and got involved with Hunters for BC 2 years ago due to great concern for declining ungulate numbers in BC, and is trying to do what he can to improve wildlife. So again, that's Neil Findlay. He's hopefully our co-host. We might have to work through some technical challenges with him, so if you can be patient. And our main guest of the evening, of course, is Dr. Garry Merkel. I am going to read you a little intro on Garry that was published by the UBC Faculty of Forestry. It was just so well done that I didn't feel like I needed to rewrite anything. So UBC Faculty of Forestry granted an honorary doctorate in science to Garry in 2021 in recognition of the remarkable contributions he has made to advance the culturally relevant education and economic self-determination of Indigenous peoples. Garry is a member of the Tahltan Nation and a registered professional forester with the Association of BC Forest Professionals. His achievements and contributions are numerous and span decades. They include being instrumental in the formation of the Faculty of Forestry's First Nations Council of Advisors in 1994, in which he currently serves as co-chair. He also worked with UBC First Nations House of Learning to establish an Aboriginal Forestry Initiative at UBC. I could go on and on about Garry. I think that most of you are going to be pretty familiar with who he is, and there is more information about Garry on our website as well. So Dr. Garry Merkel is now responsible for providing advice and guidance to support government in its leadership role in implementing the 14 recommendations and facilitating the paradigm shift in the old growth strategic review. This role involves facilitation, coaching, and mentoring amongst the key players involved with the broader forest sector. Garry will speak about the major shifts that BC is going through with respect to managing forests and lands, what initiatives are driving these shifts, example FRPA changes, Together for Wildlife, forest revitalization, and onwards, preliminary visioning around where we are going and what the Hunters for BC and you as individuals might do to support these shifts. He will also be gathering your thoughts on things that you need to feel will be worked through as we move forward through these shifts. So tonight we are presenting an overview of the provincial initiatives underway to improve management of wildlife habitat in BC. Thank you all for attending. I'm going to hand things over to Garry.
Can you enable screen sharing for me, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
If I can remember how to do that, give me a quick second.
It's on video sharing. Yeah, there you go. Oh, did you get it? Oh.
Oh.
Or no, it isn't.
There we go. I got it.
Yeah. Let's see if this works. Oh yeah, good. Okay. I'll just start this from the start here. Thank you. It's to talk to a bunch of kindred souls, I'm sure. I don't know if a lot of you knew this, but my family, we owned an outfitting business for a long time. When I was young, my grandfather started it, and my uncle, well, he bought it out and then ran it for many years, and then my uncle ran it, and I worked at it quite a bit over the years, mostly dealing with our horses and stuff. So there was a time, you know, just like it's like fish stories, they get better as you age. So today I'm going to do a short presentation. I don't know how long it's going to take. I'll try to keep it to half an hour or so at the most, and then we're going to open the floor for conversation. Earlier that one of my roles now, government asked me to come back, and I've been working with many different people in the forest sector to try to help facilitate implementation of the recommendations and start to build collaboration and get everybody properly involved, particularly in the old growth strategic review recommendations, and shifting our management paradigm for forests, but also on a bunch of other things that I might have a chance to talk about today. It's oh, okay, I see. What may be happening here, you know what? Let me, somebody's telling me that they can't see this properly. So let me, I'm going to do something else here. Is that better? Full screen?
Yes.
Okay,
great.
Good. Yeah, I have two screens here, so it just was on the wrong screen. Thanks for whoever did that. As Amberly mentioned, I'm Teltan, and for those of you, when I introduce myself from I say I'm from the Idzertsa family and related to the asps. For those of you who were in the guide outfitting community, some of you would know my grandfather George Idzertsa and my uncle Arnold Idzertsa. We ran the Snowden outfitting for many years, and you see down below there, below my name, Nadideniza Uche. That means my Teltan name is Nadideniza, which means strong man. I know it's a bit old, but I tell all my friends smell isn't everything. And the other one is Huchakli Kiakhunik, the third line. And Kiakhunik is my Tanaka name. I've lived down in the Kootenays, East Kootenays now for about 30 or 40 years with the Tanaka, and they gave me a name of fish person because they've lost their fish here, the salmon and the Columbia, and I still have a fish camp up north that I go to every year for a month or so if I can do it. So that's a little bit about enough about me. So a lot of you probably seen a lot of this stuff out there right now, all these provincial initiatives. We've got, and I'll speak about each of these individually and talk about them as how they relate. This is the list of big things that are happening right now in the province. There's a couple that I don't have paper on, so I'll just speak about those first. Some of them I do speak about in more detail. One is DRIPA, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. The provincial government passed this last year. And what it is it's a piece of legislation that says that we as a province are going to conform to and live by the principles outlined in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. And what those are basically is it says these are real people with a real government and real territories, and we should respect them like that. The power of the state still remains. It doesn't undermine it, but it does much more formally recognize these as real governments that deserve real intergovernmental attention. And so that has significant consequences in land management that I'll speak about a little bit later. The other one, I think, is the ecosystem health legislation. This is a piece of legislation that was proposed or recommended in the Old Growth Strategic Review. And I'll read you the recommendation. It says, declare the conservation and management of ecosystem health and biodiversity of British Columbia's forests as an overarching priority and enact legislation that legally establishes priority for all sectors. So moving from a management model that says the forests are all about resources to moving to a management model that says we're all about managing forests for health, and we'll take what they give us when we do that. The other one that I haven't put a lot on here, I'll speak more to it later, is the watershed security strategy out of the Ministry of Environment, which is about restoring watershed integrity in the province. So let me start here. First off, I looked at your website and for Hunters for BC, this chapter, Safari Club International chapter, and I see here your mission to actively promote, support, and advocate for responsible conservation and management of British Columbia's wildlife and natural resources. So I'll try to frame this conversation along those lines and some of the thinking behind a lot of the initiatives that are going on now. And I just see a remarkable amount of, from my mind anyways, a remarkable amount of overlap between where we're trying to move as a province and this mission statement. So I'm going to, at the largest scale right now, we are really trying to achieve what I'd characterize as three things. The first one is to start to bring back healthy ecosystems in this province. A lot of people think that the forestry paradigm that we've been working in for many years now, and I've written a lot of the AAC models. I worked in the timber industry, worked all through the whole sector myself. The model that we started with was the idea that we were going to convert the entire timber harvesting land base in British Columbia to second growth managed forests. And we were going to do that. And because of obviously our stumpage system and competitive bidding, the only profitable way to do most silviculture now is clear cut, because you're competing against other people who will bid to low. So it essentially involves clearing areas and replanting them to manage forests, second growth managed forests. And, you know, that kind of makes sense in a way, but what we started to realize, I think, probably about 35 years ago or so, 30 years ago, was that this style of management was having a lot of unexpected consequences, and that the old growth component of the landscape is a critical piece of the landscape. And when I say old growth component, I don't mean, you know, the timber definition of growth is more than 140 years in the interior and more than 250 years on the coast, but that's not really what defines old growth. In any ecosystem, it doesn't matter what the ecosystem is, an ecosystem is a whole set of things that live together and they have relationships and there's processes going on. It's a very complex organism. Think of it like your body, and the trees might be just like the bones of the body, but there's many other pieces of that body that are essential for that whole thing to stay alive and healthy. And what it turns out is that when you start to convert that at the scale we're doing it now, you start to create a huge risk to biodiversity. Biodiversity means the range of plants and the range of species that live in an area and interact with each other and depend on each other. So it's the number of those. And the simpler you make that system, the more of that biodiversity that disappears. So think of it just like this. If you're out in the prairies and you got a grassland, that you go into those grasslands, there's tons of bugs and birds and thing, and it's a whole complex system that has a lot of processes that in general have learned to live on and keep that landscape in a pretty steady state. Once you convert it to farms, now you have to start really intensively managing it to keep it as a farm. And if you do that at a big enough scale, you can actually have some fairly significant consequences without serious ongoing fertilization, fallowing, and a whole bunch of other things. And it's very similar, a very similar construction and concept. If you got rid of everything. So what we found, science tells us that you need these old parts of an ecosystem to keep the landscape healthy at a small scale and at a large scale. And in fact, you don't just need a little bit of it in certain spots. You actually need it across a landscape, and you need all kinds of it. You need the rich lowland ecosystems, you need the mid-slope ones, you need the upper slope ones in all different types, and they need to connect to each other. Otherwise, you move that whole landscape backwards in time, you reduce its biodiversity, it becomes less resilient and less resistant to disease and bugs and all those other things. It becomes more susceptible to disease. The water cycling doesn't work as well. Many of the functions that those ecosystems have naturally, if they were in their existing state, start to disappear. So the thinking here is we need to come back to building these things healthy, because the feeling is that we're creating a situation here where we're going to be in serious trouble economically and biologically if we don't start to take care of the health of our ecosystems in a lot better way than we have been. The second one is the kind of larger thing, is to get stable governance. And you notice underneath here, I made a list under ecosystem health. Each of these initiatives are contributing, have state as part of their stated goal towards building healthy ecosystem. The Old Growth Strategic Review, Modernized Land Use Planning, changes in the Forest and Range Practices Act, the Together for Wildlife, and the Water Security Strategy. The second piece, the second large area that we are working in now, is trying to stabilize our governance. For those of you who've been around the block a few times in this province, you notice that we flip-flop in our politics on a regular basis, and we flip back and forth between different administrations and change our entire management framework, and that's really unsettling from a practical management perspective, but it's really unsettling for public, and it's unsettling for all of the different groups who rely on or live with the forest in some way. And every one of these flips, it causes all kinds of anxiety. And the reason, I mean, we're trying to manage ecosystems in this province. Some of them, we have some ecosystems on the coast, from what science tells us, that have remained relatively undisturbed since the Ice Age. So they're more than 10,000 years. Trees are not an ecosystem. Trees are the product of an ecosystem, a healthy ecosystem. And so the notion is, the thinking is, and this is a public resource in this province, it's not a private resource. The thinking is that we need to start to create governance that can survive those political cycles and start to look after the land in a way that is much more stable and grounded in our collective wisdom, which involves governance structures. It involves the Indigenous community will likely provide a good rudder over time, and it involves involving all the key people who live in the forest, who are interested in being part of determining how to manage and use that forest. And so it will be less flip-flopping all over the place. So governance is supported by the Indigenous Partnership through DRIPA. The Old Growth Strategic Review advocates community resource boards. The FRPA changes are speaking about forest landscape plans, which involve, again, multi-party planning. Together for Wildlife speaks to broad engagement of the public, and the water security strategy as well. The other thing is working towards a stable society and economy. The current model that sits right now, our current projections in many of our TSAs, timber supply areas, are that we're going to go well below the what's called LRSI, the long run sustained yield average, the long run sustainable harvest, for a few decades. In some areas that we're going to go more than 50% lower than that long run thing in the short term for probably 30, 40 years. And that really is because we are overusing the forest, and we learned a lot. We calculated a theoretical maximum of what we could take out of the forest, and we're finding out that that maximum, we didn't account for everything, and so we are actually taking more than we probably should have. We've built an industry bigger than we should have. And you know, I mean, everybody's using their best wisdom. I was part of all of that when we did it. And so, like one of my good friends who owns one of the major companies and forest companies in British Columbia, he says, you know, I know that this model isn't sustainable for the long run, and I know it's going to be a tough time. I'm really looking forward to when we get to a model that is sustainable and does create a stable economy, as opposed to this one that we're in right now, because it just isn't working for any of us. So DRIPA again points to that with the involvement of the Indigenous community. It reduces a lot of uncertainty and introduces a stable partner into the whole economy. The Old Growth Review speaks and supports a lot of transition planning. The forestry intentions policy piece has a number of revitalization components in it. And the FRPA changes are also directed to doing this as well. All of these things require a paradigm shift, a shift in the way we think. In the Old Growth Strategic Review, we speak to this paradigm shift. Al and I, Al Gorley, a lot of you will know Al Gorley, who are in the forestry community, and I were coerced into doing this almost. And we're glad to have done it, but both of us said no the first time. We're busy being half retired and doing other things. But the shift we've realized, let me just read you this. It says, many of the recommendations in this report are also shaped by our recognition that society is undergoing a paradigm shift, and public policy related to forest management will need to adapt accordingly. One of the most surprising things for Al and I both, when we went out and talked to the whatever 1,000 people we talked to build this report, was the incredible level of consensus, including from within the forest sector, that we need to move to a different style of managing. This style is not working for anybody. And the broad, or what we heard the most, is that we need to move from thinking of the forest purely as timber and stop managing for timber subject to constraints, and move to a paradigm of managing for healthy ecosystems and taking what the ecosystem's giving us as opposed to pushing them beyond their ability to supply it in a way that can maintain healthy ecosystems. There's a number of other elements of that paradigm shift. I won't necessarily go through them, but I think they're in this strategic review for those of you who are interested in looking at it, a new future. So this requires a shift in the way we think, and this is not going to be an easy shift because British Columbia was built on a timber industry paradigm. I'm really, it's all, in a way, it's deeply embedded in our whole, it's a systemic thing. It's kind of like who we are. It's like Alberta, oil and gas is paramount, and they have a real bias and deeply rooted bias in that industry. And we have the same, in the timber industry. But our perception, our observation was from every sector we spoke to, is that people's ideas about this have changed. And when we wrote the Old Growth Report, felt that we were at a real critical turning point in society right now. So we wrote what we wrote, thinking we both come from a wide range of backgrounds. And surprisingly enough, it aligned with many of the other things that were coming out at the same time. And we didn't read all those and copy them in any way. We did this just from what we heard and what we know from many, many decades of working in this sector. So a new future, the Old Growth Review tells us these are the 14 recommendations. First off, doing all of this under an Indigenous provincial government partnership, prioritizing ecosystem health, moving to a 3-zone management framework, because we do have some lands in this forest that make sense to intensively manage. I think the islands on the Fraser River that Scott Paper manages for toilet paper, the cottonwoods, fast-growing cottonwoods are a good example. This strengthening our governance framework and building these regional management boards, trying to build a system that survives political flip-flopping. One of the things we heard from many people was the lack of trust they have in the information going out there. They hear something from environmental groups, and they hear something from industry, and they hear something from they hear something from it, and they don't know who to trust because it all sounds different. We need to have a system that produces reliable information and educates public about how forests work actually and how to manage in this way. In this province, we did an old growth strategy 25 years ago, and if we had implemented that strategy, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now, with the ecosystems that are on the verge of collapse and a number that already have. We did some small pieces of it, but they were so minor they didn't make a difference. For the bulk of the strategy, we didn't implement it because we had a change in administration. And so we have a number of ecosystems right now that are at very high risk because there's just so few of them left. And those are the deferral ones that you've heard about in the news lately, that we're just trying to hang on to them for a couple of years, trying to defer harvesting in them for a couple of years to give us something to work with as we plan how to manage for ecosystem health and have those options actually available for. Just because you're managing for ecosystem health doesn't mean that you can't take things from the forest. It just means you have to do it in a very different way than what we're doing it right now. We also have quite a few areas in the province where we've actually set legal targets for old growth, and we are not complying with those. We have blown past those standards, and so we have said you have to work to come into compliance with those, with your own law. You can't have law and then just ignore it. And so you either got to change the law or you got to change the way you're working. Whatever you got to do, you got to come into compliance. We also recommend that you need to improve management. We need a much better monitoring and evaluation system. One of the key recommendations in the report 25 years ago was that we have a lot of science around how to do this, but we need to learn a lot more. And so we need to build into the system how to monitor what we're doing, how to learn, and how to adapt over time. And we also need to rethink our whole objectives and our targets in terms of what's acceptable to keep us in an old growth state. You can still take trees out of, as long as you maintain the old growth attributes in the area. It requires using different silviculture systems, and it requires a different kind of stumpage system and a bidding system to make that possible. But we have seen numerous examples in this province, operational examples by numerous companies and individuals who have proven that it is possible to do things in a very different way on the ground. We also need to improve our inventory if we're going to manage for ecosystems. Our current forest inventory is built for timber. It talks about size and age and a few other characteristics, but it doesn't speak about old growth. Old growth doesn't mean, age is part of being old growth, but old growth really means a forest or a grassland or an aquatic system or whatever that has grown up to a stage where it's still kind of changing, because things change all the time, but it's now changing within a natural range of variability. It's still changing, stable at a larger scale because it's kind of finished growing up. It's in its senior years and can stay there forever in that state, or until something potentially happens, major catastrophic event or thing like that. Our inventory is not built to manage for that at this point, and it needs to be updated. We need to update our definitions of old growth in order to accommodate this kind of ecosystem health management. And we need to start to use a lot better practices that better mimic and maintain stand attributes of these old growth systems, so that we don't end up compromising them at a larger scale. And then finally, there's some recommendations around making orderly transitions to these new management approaches and for communities. And our recommendation is that these need to be done in a way that engages all the relevant players. This is not coming from the ivory tower thing, or coming from industry, or coming from any one group. It needs to engage everybody in this, and we need to apply our collective wisdom, help us work through this, because it's a very complex process. We think that if we do this, we will end up with healthier ecosystems, we will end up with better management, and we believe we will end up with much greater public support. And again, this all requires a paradigm shift, a shift in the way we think. Together for Wildlife, a lot of you have seen this. And this one again points to all British Columbians having a voice in wildlife stewardship, having better information and using better science in our decisions, doing real things on the ground that actually help wildlife, and building a system that has a lot more accountability that we can trust and have confidence in. And again, building reconciliation and relationships with Indigenous governments. And this is a sheet. I'm not going to go through this, but it's a big list of all of the details of this. Modernized land use planning, same idea. Oh, there it is. This says, you know, the way we used to do land use planning in this province is we put a lot of you are familiar with this. We put everybody in a room and they duke it out until somebody wins and gets their way. And that is, and of course the land is thought about a certain amount in there, but this largely is a fight it out thing. And the thinking is here, we need to first off start working with the Indigenous community much more closely, and we need to start focusing on land health as our #1 driver. And then what can we do within that context? Again, similar to what the old growth strategy spoke about. And there's a number of other details in there in trying to build a stable, healthy economy, and et cetera, and inclusive governance and all the rest of that that's kind of built into this strategy as well. The forestry intentions paper speaks about creating and redistributing tenure and trying to foster more local tenures. The feeling is that you will achieve a higher standard of land stewardship potentially, but more importantly, you will have more people engaged and involved directly in looking after forests, which is what we have been hearing from communities and First Nations and individuals for a long time in this province, is they want to be a lot more involved in this. And this is a way to do that. And so improving value added, improving a number of other factors to try to promote a more robust and stable industry, a lot more focus on dealing with our tenure issues, our stumpage issues, and et cetera. There's a whole bunch of stuff inside this paper that speaks about how do we revitalize the forest sector. And then there's, I see that I didn't put FRPA in here, but I'll speak about it here. What do these things have to do with wildlife? Well, let's speak about DRIPA first, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. I think most of you understand that wildlife is a really important resource for almost all Indigenous communities in this province. In many of our communities, we believe that wildlife are like brothers and sisters is the best way I can explain it. They're equal. We're all equal in the world. And I know that view isn't shared. And I know there's a lot of society that believes that we're above animals and that we're not part of nature and all the rest of that. But that's not what we believe generally as a community. And so wildlife is a really critical element when we start to become involved in land management. DRIPA says we are going to change all of our legislation and policy in this framework to conform to the principles that Indigenous people are governments that deserve a right to be part of the decision-making in their territories. And so all of these new initiatives are building in a government-to-government component and having Indigenous communities through their governments party to planning land. So wildlife is definitely going to come into the play In fact, in our land stewardship planning process where I come from, when we are building our land stewardship plan, we put a chair at the table and we put a picture of the animal in the chair, and we sometimes stop and say, what would the caribou say? Or what would the salmon say? Because for us, it's important to understand what they think and how they need to see the world too. Together for Wildlife, obviously this is huge, at least the words on paper, and particularly the notion of moving to more collaborative governance, regional management board, advisory boards, the provincial advisory board, improving all of our data and stewardship, involving the public more, and doing all of the things that were heard when they went out and did the outreach on this. Some of you may know my partner Al did the moose strategy for the province as well, which was the precursor for this Together for Wildlife. And he went out and talked to everybody in the province about what we wanted to do with moose, and he got a lot of the same answers. The FRPA changes are significant. The first big change is that FRPA now says we need to manage for ecosystem health. And the without unduly affecting timber supply is being removed from all of the legislation at this point. We are moving to a new planning framework, forest landscape plan, that says, you know, we have all these large landscape goals, but we have 100 volume operators working in an area, and we have no way to track or ensure that we're meeting these larger landscape goals because everybody's kind of going off and doing their own thing. Their plans are all totally okay. They're legal, they're approved, but there's no system to bring all that together and knit it at a larger scale. Forest landscape, multi-sectoral planning tables that will do area-based planning on and layout on the landscape around what you can do and where and how in order to meet the larger, higher level goals around wildlife, around old growth, around ecosystem health, and all the rest of those types of things that require looking at things from a landscape level. It's not a site-by-site thing. Of course, you have to look at sites, but you have to think landscape. The old growth strategic review speaks again. Its thing is all about managing for ecosystem health and recognizing that old growth is a critical component of healthy ecosystems, and having collaborative governance and moving through this transition together. And the philosophy here is healthy ecosystems. Nature takes care of things quite well. It starts to get all out of whack when we start trying to think we're smarter than it and doing things. And so the thinking here is, let's try to mimic nature a lot more and let nature take care of things, as opposed to trying to save little patches on the landscape for old trees and wildlife and all the rest of that. Let's try to keep our ecosystems intact, healthy, take what we can for them, but make sure they stay healthy, and then they will take care of everything else. And we don't have to manage for every little species and every little thing, because nature will take care of it. The modernized land use planning, again, ecosystem health, deeply Indigenous driven, all those philosophies will get in there. All the new modernized plans that are underway right now, I think there's about 9 of them in the province, are all being done in partnership with Indigenous governments. The modernized forest policy, the intentions paper, actually did advocate the FRPA changes. And it's talking about reintroducing fire back into the landscape, 10-year redistribution, forced revitalization again. And then this watershed security strategy, again, with respect to wildlife, speaks about healthy watersheds as ecosystems and healthy fish that depend on everything else, and starting to restore the health of watersheds. In other words, watershed ecosystems, which again is nothing but good for wildlife. So kind of a real quick snapshot. In the future, this is a very preliminary, my own thinking We will have an Indigenous provincial G2G partnership. We'll have regional planning tables that will deal with forest landscape planning, old growth strategic review, transition. Once the overarching legislation comes in, we'll see oil and gas and mines and all the other people at these tables starting to work in a way that makes sure that we keep healthy ecosystems. There's many areas in this province where ecosystem health is compromised more by other things like oil and gas or mining or infrastructure development or recreation development than it is by forestry activities. Then we also expect to have a number of policy tables that look at system changes, tenure changes, stumpage changes, AAC, changes in our methodology, setting new standards, and figuring out how to do this. And all of this built with an adaptive management piece in it. So these plans then drive operations in all the sectors when the new legislation comes in. And these policy tables drive the system changes and policy setting our standards and planning guidance and all the rest of that type of thing. This is my own view. It's not been vetted with anybody. Part of my role is to help build a vision, and my early thinking. If you think it's crazy or silly wild ass and I'm missing things, well, let me know, because this is very much straw dog stuff. So finally, kind of what can you do? Well, I said I would leave with something at least. And the first one, I would advocate that if you all care about the land, I think it's incumbent upon you to become informed on what all these things are trying to do and try to contribute in a way that is positive, in the sense of we are moving through a transition. The question is not if we're doing this anymore. The question is how. And how do we take care of as much as we can through this transition? And the only way that's going to happen is for people to get engaged and get involved. As we move to more collaborative land management, we need people to understand land and be informed about land so they can provide informed input about what's the right thing to do and still be able to take care of the other things that are important. I think your organization, you already do this, continues to advocate for the responsible harvest management, harvest and use of fish and wildlife in this province. I personally think it's a good idea to advocate for healthy landscapes, because healthy landscapes mean healthy wildlife, healthy fish, and healthy everything else. And I read your mission statement at the start, because your community would be a lot like my community. We can have 100 people stand up and say good things, and then you get one person who goes out and bees it and is an asshole or kind of does exactly opposite of what you're preaching, and it puts a bad taint on all of you. And this is where the public has said they want to go. And so their tolerance, I think, for having people who are offside with this is every survey that has been done over the last almost decade now is pointing in the 90% that's where people want to go. And so you're either on side or you're part of the problem, is kind of the way it has turned into right now. And as your organization, and you, I think, as healthy as to foster strong relations, I think there's a lot of akin thinking between your type of organization and the Indigenous community. All of us come from hunter-gatherer backgrounds of some type, and everybody thinks we're all about not using the land, and that's just not true at all. That's the furthest thing from the truth. We understand that the land is meant to be used. It's how we use it that's important. And so that is the difference. And, you know, I got a friend who has a real racist comment, and I'll say it out loud here. He says, the reason you white people have parks is because you can't trust yourselves to look after land. Really, it's not white people. It's this society, this consumer type society. If we don't have a park, we'll cut it all down. I got a good friend who's got a timber tenure now, and he phoned me up when the deferrals came out, and he said, I can't believe this. We just got this tenure. We just spent a few $1 million. He's a First Nations leader. And we're just starting our forest company, and these deferrals overlap every one of our permits. We don't know what the hell to do here. He says, this is going to make us go under. And he said, and you know, and then he says, but I just want you to know, we totally support where you're trying to go with all of this stuff. And if you give us a chance, we'll cut every last stick down. That's the way we are as a company and as an industry, if we don't have a system to deal with this. And I thought, you know, that was interesting, because I worked in the sector forever too, and I still do. And there's a lot of truth in that. And without the overarching knitting that we need to do this the right way. And I believe we all do want to. Every people we heard from in the forest sector and everywhere has said, told us this. Anyways, these Indigenous relationships, that's a bit of a tangent, sorry about that. Fostering strong relationships will serve you well, both as a human being and as an organization. And then finally, these wildlife advisory board at the provincial level and the regional advisory boards are going to take a much bigger role in wildlife management, and they're going to have to build in some kind of an outreach and engagement process. And I'd recommend highly that you get to know those people and who they are, and be able to build some good relationships there to get your information in there. So that's it. May do. Thank you. I thought I'd leave you with this little thing here, because we all think you got to be the toughest to win and survive. Not true. It's the ones who change the best and adapt to changes who survive. The strong ones who ignore the change and think they're bigger than it, die. That's the way species work. So that's it. That's it for me.
Thank you. That's an excellent presentation, and especially your summary at the end is very helpful for us going forward. I think we always have kind of walked into wildlife management not really knowing where to start, how to affect change. We just know we wanted to see some change, and it seems like a very possible and positive presentation that things are going to come down the pipe for us. So at the moment, I'm going to just get Neil to unmute, and I think Neil's going to have some discussion with you, and then I'm going to move down to the Q&A section.
Okay, I'll take this. I'll take this off so people can see who they're talking to. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. There we go.
Perfect. Neil, are you there? And
lucky me, I get to look at you, so. I can't see anybody else. So.
Yep, me neither.
It's funny. Well, I don't know if they can see me. I just did that. Some of them can.
No, it worked good.
Okay. Yeah.
It worked good. Neil, oh, there he is. We're ready for you.
Okay, thanks. Excellent talk, Gary. I really appreciate it from our organization. It gives us insight into what's going on behind some of the scenes that we may not be abundantly obvious to many of us, and it gets intimidating. There's a lot going on right now in the province, and many people seem like somewhat ineffectual, I suppose. A lot of people are passionate about wildlife habitat, but we don't really know at the high level what's going on. So we greatly appreciate your insight into that, and we know you're passionate, as is our organization, and this is just sort of giving us a little bit of insight into, you know, exactly like your last discussion was, is how do we get involved? And I think that's the biggest thing now as a group, is what do we do to sort of have our voices heard? And, you know, I imagine, Gary, you probably have the same sentiments as us, as we've seen sort of, you know, species and populations at risk, and we get concerned, and we want to help. And that's why I think that our organization got formed. And so there's a lot of people working hard here to sort of make the change, and this is part of it. And the getting into the more technical forestry type stuff, you know, you've heard me go on a few times about particular issues, and I know that you are now currently working on the details and how to make some of this stuff execute. And I think that's where a lot of the challenge is going to be. It's the sort of the devil in the details. There's a lot of ideas out there, and it's just, where do we go from here to move things ahead? And you know, one of the issues that I can't help but keeps coming back to me time and time again is the whole concept of landscape management. I think just about everybody in this organization and perhaps on this call will agree that we should be managing for the overall full suite of values that ecosystems produce, including timber. And the whole concept of forest landscape planning is, it makes sense, makes total sense, but I don't know how we can have a forest landscape plan with volume-based tenures. And what it would appear to me is that's going to happen is the government is going to start trying to tell the forest companies where and how they're going to log. And I see that just being an absolute operational nightmare as to determine who's going to log what, especially when you're into unprofitable stands. And my fear is, and this is a forester and as a citizen of BC, is that it's going to lead to the coffin nail for some of these companies to shut down their mills. I just believe it can be a huge obstacle. And I believe the way around it is to go to area-based tenures. And, you know, you touched on it for community-based tenures, but what about on a grander scale that the forest companies have area-based tenures, and then you can deal directly with them on landscape plans, so you're dealing with one individual company. The question here being after that is, what you've seen going on in the discussions you've seen, is the tenure reform to go to area-based tenures on a grand scale, if not completely across the province, is that being discussed? Is it not on the table because there's a fear of too much corporate control? Or can you give us any background on that at all, Garry, what your take on that is?
Yeah, no, I that's a good piece, Neil. And I remember you mentioned this before, and it's certainly one of the pieces that has to be worked through. All I can speak to you about is thinking at this point in time. I mean, yeah, the magic bullet is probably moving to area-based tenure. That, you know, that would be, in theory, real simple. The thing is we've got existing licenses that have to be honored, and we have to do transition and everything else. And so that may be able to happen over time. Maybe there's consolidation of licenses. We're going to see major downfalls in our AC in this province. We're going to see probably a revamping of the tenure system. A couple of thoughts, though. This is a couple of thoughts. And this is going to be definitely something that is going to be worked out with people who are in operations and industry, and how can we make this work. But this is just a couple of kind of spitball things. The first one is formalizing operating areas a little bit more. In other words, working more along the lines, kind of a pseudo area-based tenure. I know we do that already, but you know as well as I do that everybody poaches everybody else's operating area because they get into trouble in theirs for whatever reason. And that's kind of normal right now. And that may not change over time. The other one is to start to lay this out on an area base, a TSA level, for example, and then sit down with all of the licensees who have tenure and work out, okay, this is the kinds of things that can happen here, and how much, the kind of prescriptions we need, and how you can loosely lay those out in order to maintain these healthy ecosystems. Who's going to work where, and how can we do this so we all share in the good stuff and the bad stuff? In other words, because I think if you don't do that kind of a rationalization and you don't involve people, what's going to happen is you're going to see a lot of unfairness and unfair distribution of tenure. And you're going to see exactly what you spoke about, is forcing some of the less whatever ones, unlucky ones, into areas that are totally inoperable and not able to do anything. Those are just a couple spitball things at this point. You're a little bit ahead of where we're at in thinking, but it is certainly on the radar. There is small groups now thinking about this and talking to industry cohorts and saying, how can we actually make this work? I personally am advocating that dialogue between the parties increase hugely. COVID has really sucks, you know, it really kicked the legs out from under us in terms of being able to engage properly, but we're all getting so good at this now that I frankly think it's not a reasonable excuse anymore. This is not ideal. but we have learned how to work in this environment quite effectively, at this virtual environment for the most part. And we can do these things virtually if we have to.
Yeah, I agree. Excellent. I really appreciate that candid response. Amberly, I'm going to probably, without me hogging too much of the venue here, I'm going to maybe get you to turn it over to the general questions. And if there's any time left at the end, I got a few more technical type questions, but I'd like to hear from the membership and the people at large here. If you could, I'm not sure how you're going to vet the questions, or if you have a system for that, that would be great.
Yeah, there is a couple questions. Do you want me to go through these ones in the chat, or do you?
Actually, you know what I've done, Gary, is I am promoting the people that are posting questions. I am promoting their profile so that they can engage with you directly in the order that I'm receiving the questions. So
Oh boy, you're smart.
Yeah, well, we like people to be able to engage in conversation rather than a single dimensional question. So we have
this is
Doug
smart
here. Hi, Doug.
Yeah, hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, Doug.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Gary, for this opportunity. I just wanted to, mention we've seen the impacts of large-scale corporate industrial fiber mining that is just, I don't know about you, but everywhere I travel and view and work with community groups and whatnot, the watersheds are devastated. And, we recently saw what that means in this new, climate dynamic in Merritt, in Princeton, in Grand Forks a few years ago. So I just wondering whether or not we need to treat this as an emergency and have a massive shift sooner than later, considering the kinds of financial impacts that it is having now and will continue to have for decades into the future, while many of these ecosystems and watersheds have a chance to heal. And that's if we stop doing what we're doing. But we're not. Like, everywhere I go, the things are just continuing the same way, and on the large scale tenures. So I don't know how many times the billions of dollars of infrastructure, rebuilding, and complete community flooding and roads taken out, like from Spence's Bridge to Merritt, we can handle in this province before we treat it as an emergency.
Okay. Well, that's a good question. So I'll tell you my own view of this. Is that you know what, the truth of the matter is that we have too many people on this planet, and we all expect too much. But I don't see anybody standing up and volunteering to have less kids and not go to the hospital and give their car back and not buy strawberries and not buy lettuce and not do all the things that we do. Like we always blame it on the forest company, or we blame it on those people when we're all the ones using this stuff. This is a funny thing about us as human beings, and I've come to realize that this ability for mass denial is actually a survival instinct in human beings. It's because we think too much and we can't handle too much truth at once. It's truly a survival instinct. But my experience of having orchestrated a few large-scale social changes so far in my life is that if you don't change the way people think and you try to impose a major shift like this on people when they're not ready for it, you better expect incredible backlash and probably get thrown out and get exactly the opposite of what you actually wanted to do. You have to work people thinking change and make them want to do it. I share your concern that maybe it'll be too little too late. Who knows? I mean, nature is what nature is, and it will do what it does, period. The way I see this also is I'm seeing now a few Indigenous groups are developing and implementing what they're called regenerative plans, regenerative stewardship, regenerative forestry, where they are doing an accelerated focus on regenerating the landscape with a number of very specific activities and trying to rebuild those ecosystems, or at least the properties of them, in as short a time as possible, and possibly even using things like deciduous to stabilize slopes for a little while and all kinds of other things like that. And I think there's a lot of hope in that thinking. But I'm with you. And a lot of my friends say to me, you know, I know what you're saying, I know what you're advocating, but I personally, you know, think it's too late. And these are people from industry and from everywhere. Like, we've already caused so much, we may not be able to fix it. I have to be an optimist. If I'm not an optimist, I would just go home right now and I wouldn't even be bothered talking to you people. I wouldn't be doing this. I have to believe that it can happen. I have to believe in people that we can make it. So that's the way I operate, and that's the way I have to operate and help make it happen as fast as we can. I have the same sense of urgency. Believe it or not, the government has the same sense of urgency. This COVID, as I said, has kicked the crap out of us, plus dealing with all these emergencies that we've been dealing with. And in spite of it, I'm still surprised at the amount of effort that they're putting in. Let me give you a small example. The person who's leading the old growth file, implementation file, I just found out the other day, is also responsible for dikes. Yeah, so you can imagine how hard it is. And every one of those people is like that. They've all got something, multiple, and they're doing this in spite of all of that. So I think, frankly, and confused, and, you know, working in uncharted territories like the rest of us. So that's all I can say about that. I'm in the business of trying to change the way people think and the way we do things in a different way. Yeah.
Thank you, Doug. Thomas.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
No.
Oh. Gary, Thomas Munson here.
How you doing, Thomas?
Very good. First of all, congratulations on your doctorate. That's great. I'm glad to see you're doing good work still.
Thanks.
Gary and I mentioned, Gary lives in Ktunaxa territory. I worked with Gary many years ago on the Ktunaxa-Kinbasket treaty table and land claims negotiations, which are still going on, I understand. Yeah. My question, Gary, you mentioned very early on that a paradigm shift is needed, and a paradigm shift is a change in how we think. But in my mind, a paradigm shift is also a change in what actions we take after we think. And so I'm wondering if you can give a ballpark of how long it will be before there is a change in industrial forestry after we change our way of thinking. I think you made an example with the old growth strategy that it could be 10 years of business as usual before the model changes. Well, 10 years will be a lot of lost old growth. So how long between a paradigm shift in thinking and a paradigm shift in actually acting?
Okay, that's a good... Shifting thinking takes time. There's no question about that. And shifting thinking has to start with individuals, and then it grows to groups, and then it grows to society. One of the interesting things about facilitating a paradigm shift, if you work as a sociologist, is you only really have to change about 23% of the population to change the whole population, because the rest tend to follow. And you can see Canada right now going through a major paradigm shift with respect to its understanding of its relationship to Indigenous people, and why we are doing reconciliation and why we need to do it. You can see that happening. You can see a change in paradigm with respect to respect for Indigenous people, that they're not the kind of dumb people who don't belong in society that we always thought they were. You can see that change. You can see a lot of these other kinds of things. But so you can't just wait for people to change their thinking. You actually have to actively facilitate and support that change. And I have written with a few other people a strategy to facilitate a paradigm shift that we are now looking at, to try to facilitate a change in thinking in this province. What 10 years was that it would take us 10 years to really start to fully be into this new one and really start to realize the benefits of changing our thinking. In the interim, there's probably going to be some regulation required to help us get there and some enforcement of new ways of doing things. So this is not, in my mind, about doing what we did for 10 years. If we learned anything from the failed implementation of the previous whole growth strategy, waiting puts us in a much worse situation economically, environmentally, and socially. And we need to deal with this issue now. We can't wait another 10 or 20 or whatever years. We saw what the last 25 years did to us, and there is zero appetite amongst the people who see what happened to go further in this hole. So that's my answer to that, is that it is a bit of a, I characterize it as a push me, pull me thing. You got to use a carrot, but you also got to use a bit of a stick.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Hope to see you in live really soon.
I hope so too. Hear you,
Thank you,
Thomas.
I have Dave Rolston up next. Hi, Dave.
Hi, good evening. Thanks for all your presentations. Yeah, it's been challenging to say the least. I'm a fisheries manager and biologist who works for First Nations out of on the Somas watershed, and it's got issues like a lot of other watersheds. And oh man, it's complicated and difficult trying to figure out if there is any way we can tie things together, because this last heat dome really was a big event. The sockeye moved out of the system into the inlet for about 2 or 3 months, and there's a lot of starting at the top end, forestry, there's agriculture, there's industry at the mouth. It's kind of a mess. Yeah, with respect to forestry though, there's been some really big changes in water retention and water release, snowpack, and I'm just wondering if you see any hope in the horizon with some of these newer outreach policy stuff that's been going on here provincially in trying to tie some of these users and some of this legislation together. That some of which you brought up tonight. I was wondering if you could speak to some of that around water use and impacts to hydrologic regimes and all that sort of stuff.
I'm not an expert in the province's new water security strategy, but that is exactly the purpose of that, is to start to restore the integrity and water hydraulic function in our watersheds and the habitat for the fish and all of the rest of that. And there is money and programming already started to be invested in that. Yeah. I'm a little bit concerned about that. I was involved in building forest renewal when we built it. I was there on the day it opened. I was there on the day it closed, and we had a watershed restoration program, and we're doing a lot of really amazing, what I thought was quite amazing work to restore watersheds and restore stream habitat and temperatures and cover and all the rest of those things. Ecosystem health doesn't just mean trees. It means ecosystem. It means water too. And so the question we have not asked ourselves yet, and which I alluded to earlier, is how do we actually, we have compromised a number of ecosystems in this province, like most of them, frankly. The only places that haven't been compromised are ones that we can't get at that well yet. And even some of those we have just even from just excessive access. And so the question becomes now, how do you actually regenerate the landscape? How do you regenerate ecosystems? How do you do some of this regenerative forestry or regenerative stewardship that I spoke about? And I can tell you that it's a live issue on everybody's radar, but it's not today, because we have to figure out how do we get through this next little bit. How do we address, we put a number of deferrals in place in this province just to try to hang on to some of the key last irreplaceable ecosystems, of the remnants of what's left in some, so we have something to work with as we start this restoration process. And the impact of those deferrals, those are 2-year, don't harvest these for 2 years till we can start building plans around how to, if and when and how do we take these trees and harvest and manage the forest from this point forward with all sectors. And so just even that little action of deferring has had significant ripple effects that are taking a lot of work just to get through, setting up all the tables to deal with the rest of the recommendations. I'm not making excuses. I'm only saying that we're a little bit buried in early implementation right now and not quite at the stage of fully thinking that through, but it is definitely on the minds of a number of people. I've actually advocated recently that maybe we should think about hiring a few scientists to work with some good bush practitioners and start to think about how do we actually restore some of these systems in a what are some techniques that we can use at a large scale, start looking around the world for ideas, start looking around British Columbia. I think we have the smarts to do this. It's really an organization problem from the way I see it anyways, if we haven't gone too far. I do worry about that. I think we have gone too far in some areas, some of the areas I've seen. It's going to be a long time before we can bring them back, but a lot of them are fixable within a reasonable time frame. They won't be what they were, but they will at least be a lot healthier than what they are right now. I know that's a bit vague because purposely we're just not quite there in the thinking yet.
Thank you, Dave. I'm going to bring Jay up next.
Hello, thank you. Very interesting talk, Garry. Very thought-provoking. The thing a number of people have brought up, this climate crisis we're in the middle of. Yes. And I think that is the key thing. And it may almost, because this, some of the climate crisis stuff that's really come to the fore here in British Columbia has come out since your old growth review came out. And, people are saying, the IPCC said, well, we have less than 10 years to get our CO2 in the atmosphere under control, in fact, going down. And here we are saying, well, we should save this old growth. And most people have said, well, there's hundreds of years of carbon stored in old growth. When old growth is clear cut and burned off, within very few years, 70% of that carbon, which took hundreds of years to put in there, is now up in the atmosphere. So how do we get governments to recognizing old growth as a carbon sequester that's basically going to save British Columbia and this planet?
Climate change and carbon, actually, we have a new branch in government that has been dedicated to thinking that through. And how do we actually start managing for carbon as one of the key values? Carbon, you're right, carbon is, when it goes in the forest, it's like a bank. When it's in those big trees, it's banked there. It's all living things are made up of carbon. So things like forbs and brush and stuff like that will release a lot of carbon when you open up a forest, because they'll just disintegrate. If you don't convert those trees into chips or small dimension lumber and you keep them in large timbers and things like that, they still have their value as a bank. The other thing is it really depends on how you the silviculture system that you use. On the coast, we saw a few places where individuals and smaller companies have used very selective systems, removing about 20 or sorry, about 20, I think 27% was the magic number they found. More than that, it was uneconomical. Less than that, they weren't getting, it was too hard and too difficult. They take about 27% of the stand from, and they take it across the profile. They don't just take the big trees. They take, you know, a few big trees, few medium trees, few small trees, that type of thing. And so then you're retaining most of the carbon, you're letting the other stuff grow up and sequester more. And then how do you use it at the other end? You know, but this whole climate, I got to say this, sometimes I feel like fixing the way we look after forests in the face of this whole climate crisis is a bit like shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic, because we have much bigger problems. But you know what? I always try to think of the adage of think locally and act globally. Or in other words, if you don't fix your own backyard and start to be a model for others and start to actually do it in some way, shape, or form at the biggest scale that you can, then how can you be an example? You could stand there and yell at everybody, but they're not going to listen. You have to do it and show people. And so my view is that's kind of how I rationalize to myself that we really have to start doing this. But I am very aware of climate change because it's affecting where I live and where I come from significantly as well. It's going to change our predator-prey relationship from a wolf moose to a caribou deer over a period of time. And we think we got about 10, 15 years before that happens. That's a huge change.
Thank you, Jay. I'm going to bring up Robin now.
Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Okay, thank you, Gary.
Yeah.
A lot to think about for sure. Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Amberly, as well. This is very good. I guess I have this guilty conscience where I logged for 20 years. It's not guilty conscience, but I've been taking from the land my entire life since I was old enough to work. So that being said, I'm glad to see that, you know, some people are definitely alarmed and gravely concerned, as am I. So you can count on me to do my part for the paradigm shift, and hope I can help any way possible. I do have one question, and I know I may be a one-trick pony when I get on something. I can't get it out of my head, but I would like to just talk briefly about our incredibly high resource road density in the province. How is resource road density affecting our ecosystems? And is this going to be part of the new strategy on how we can manage these road densities and make our province, you know, on the track to healing?
Excellent question. But just before I do that, I'm going to tell you, I talk to people a lot about how to, you know, different ways to look after land. And a lot of times I open with, you know, here I am today talking to you about elephants, and I probably killed 5 of them just getting here. We're all hypocrites. So let's just start by acknowledging that and learning to live with that and learning to deal with it so that we can actually take the first step to change. The first step to change is accepting and understanding, and then learning and growing. And we're like this because society lets us be that, then expects us to be that. So getting stuck in guilt and blame doesn't help. Moving to that acceptance and learning and growing helps. Roads are a key part of impact on ecosystem health, particularly to the larger. A lot of you know that road density has a really direct correlation to caribou populations of birds, and a number of other things, and the impacts from people to those areas. Montana was interesting, implemented a thing to save their caribous. They just closed the whole backcountry to motorized access and took the political crap for doing it. And I don't know if we have the courage
Hang tight, everybody. Gary is on satellite internet. We've obviously got a hiccup.
Keeping healthy ecosystems means that you have to manage access and road density, and you need to move to a system. Some of you as foresters or planners will be familiar with total chance planning. So in other words, you plan a whole landscape and you plan, okay, I'm going to go into this area of the landscape for this time frame. I'm going to close it out, and then I'm going to go into this one, and you plan that out over many, possibly even 100-year time frame. I think that kind of thinking is going to have to come into where we are, but I honestly don't know that we're ready to do that as a province yet. But as we shift our paradigm and as we start to understand how important it is to look after these ecosystems, they look after you. I think that in the future, this kind of thing will be much more possible, but it really requires that we shift our paradigm in order to be able to deal with those types of issues, because our paradigm is not like that at all right now. We certainly do have this mentality that the land's there for it's only there for us and we can do what we want with it almost. And it's just really unhealthy for all of us. Anyways, sorry, that's a bit of a diatribe, but I'm kind of with you on that one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Robin. Tom, I have you up next.
You're muted, Tom, just in case you're talking away. I do that all the time. Maybe you have to go to the bathroom.
Maybe too. I'm going to bring John Nielsen up now, and if Tom gets back to us, then we'll keep him there just in case.
Yeah,
Hi, John.
Hi there. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So, Garry, thanks so much for your talk and your great work. And speaking as a past member of COSIWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, I was really pleased to hear about the changes to FRPA in particular.
Yes.
But that's really good to hear. But getting to the specific case of Fairy Creek, which I'm a fish guy, so this is all learning for me. I had assumed, looking at the distribution of old growth on southern Vancouver Island, that there would be a lot of interest in doing proper biological surveys prior to road construction and harvesting. And this was my sort of naive perception of how the system worked. And turns out I was greatly mistaken in my assumption. And as a result of this, we've seen some damage to stands of old growth speckled belly lichen, which were a special concern in the last COSIWIC assessment, and some other serious impacts, which I really think we could have avoided if there were proper surveys done before industry started doing their thing. So I was just wondering, under this new paradigm, will we see better sort of surveys of what we've got before we even start messing with it?
Yeah. When you manage for ecosystem health, you work within broad parameters on a landscape. Like you try to retain a certain portion of old growth or a certain portion of the area that at least has the attributes of old growth, old ecosystems. And so that means light touch type impacts. So those types of systems tend to be start with, and that's not the answer. I'm getting to the answer. Sorry, I'm kind of wandering off on a bit of a tangent here, but it's the reason I say that is because in any ecosystem health management regime, you also flag special areas that you have to pay special attention to. And I had said to you earlier that our current inventory was not designed for ecosystem health management. It was designed for timber management. It's all about how big your trees are and how many you have and how many are on the site and all that type of stuff. We do have an ecosystem classification system that classifies our province into different ecosystem types, but that still doesn't give us the kinds of level of detail that you're speaking about of what are the really critical things in this ecosystem that really need to be kept beyond the old growth to keep it healthy, and how do we start mapping those out, and how do we start paying attention to them. So my short answer is yes, of course that becomes part of the thinking. The more difficult part is how do you actually start now to build that database of what's important in these different ecosystems, start to include them in our inventories and start planning for them properly. And those are all significant operational questions that are not just simple to solve. They're on the radar, but they're not done yet. They are part of what needs to happen. Yeah. I wish I had more, I wish I had tons more answers for everybody, that we've got all this done and all this done, but this is early in this path. We are turning a major ship around here. I say to one of my friends, this is like steering a ship that has about 1,000 levers, and you got to pull every one just a certain amount in the right order, and keep doing that over and over until you get it to actually start to turn. So it's not a real simple job, this thing.
That's awesome, Garry. You're doing a great job, and I know I'm certainly appreciating it. John, will let you go on this, and I'm just going to check in. Tom, did you manage to connect in at all? There you are. Awesome.
Hi there.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm talking to you from Vancouver Island, and yeah, I'm happy to be able to join. A little new to the Zoom thing, but yeah, I have a question, and I guess where I'm coming from is I'm an environmental monitor, and I guess I would say that it's probably I would want your take on it, of course, but is it advisable to be cutting any trees at all? And if we are, or if it isn't advisable, then how can we be part of a solution instead of part of a problem in BC? Is that a choice that a government can make?
That's a good question. For the coast, it is possible, I guess, that you could not cut trees and just leave it to its own devices in most areas, and it would be probably staying relatively static and in the state that it's in now, whatever that kind of equilibrium or balance is of the ecosystem. But in fire areas, that doesn't work as well unless you actually put fire or let fires burn, because fire is a necessary part of a fire landscape to keep it healthy. And so if you're going to stop fire in a landscape, you've got to do something else to actually keep that landscape healthy, or otherwise it starts to stagnate and gets ingrown and overgrown and gets really unhealthy over a very quick period of time. It's surprising how fast that can happen in fire maintained ecosystems. But is it advisable? I want to go back to what I said earlier in this thing. The land, my personal philosophy and what I have grown up with in my life and what I've always been taught is the land is meant to be used. It's how you use it that's the question. And so somebody earlier said, this paradigm shift is a hard thing. Well, it is a hard thing. I often say to people, this is like telling a Roman Catholic community that you're going to be Buddhist tomorrow and you're going to act like it. Well, that's not going to happen. If we made a decision to do that, we would take a little while to actually change everybody's mind, and we would take an even longer while to change their behaviors. I know this is a bit off topic, but I wanted to say that earlier, and I just throw it out there for fun. I'm in the world where I think there's areas where we may already be in too much trouble, and maybe we need to stop and heal the landscape for a bit. But there is a lot of areas still in this province where we do have room to work, maybe not at the levels we were before. And we can still take things and do it in a way that that is gentle and looks after the health of the ecosystems. If I don't, but you know, that's really a case by case thing. There is no such thing as blanket rules in nature, unfortunately. Everybody always looks for the magic bullet and looking after land thinking, oh yeah, if you just do this, it'll all be good. Well, land doesn't work like that. I mean, land, you can never really understand how. The best you can do is learn how to live with it right. Once you start thinking you can control it, and once you start getting into that mindset, it inevitably turns out that you end up causing some serious grief. But I wouldn't say yes unequivocally, but I would say there probably are some areas that we have gone too far, and we may need to slow down hugely or curtail for a while. And I don't know where those are yet, but I have a sense of where they might be.
Thank you so much, Tom. Laura, I have you up next.
Hi, thank you. Appreciate being able to ask a question. So
I know this lady.
we have talked on email.
Yes, we have. I
Thanks for
recognize his name.
recognizing
Yeah.
my unique name.
Yeah.
So my question is around the deferrals and the supports or not that are in place or not for the nations.
Yep.
You know, like for over a year, we were hearing from the government, you know, we need to talk with First Nations, we need to do this right, we need to get it right. And then suddenly in November, we hear the deferrals and it's super exciting. And then we hear, well, no, we got to get it right and talk to all the First Nations and help them decide. And it sounded like the deferrals were a total shock to most of the nations. From what I hear on the outside here, from what Chief Stuart Phillips has said, it seems like nations are left to decide on things that they feel they would be detrimental to them either way, or they don't have the resources, the knowledge, the options. And it seemed to me like the NDP was just kind of doing it like it's made to fail in that regard. And so I'm wondering what knowledge and assurance you might have from the inside if it isn't really how it looks, as if, like I said, looking as if it's not been supported. Maybe, you know, maybe it is being, and we're just not being told about that.
I'm going to give you an example. I did an interview a while back. I can't even remember what it was. And the reporter went out and found a First Nations person to come up with a contrary view and put it in the paper. And I said, you know, I think that's actually quite misleading. And he said it. And I said, well, you know what? There's 200 communities and 200 chiefs in this province, plus a number of tribal leaders, plus all of their. I'm pretty sure you can go out and find somebody to support your point of view and lobby it. I personally don't pay a lot of attention to all that rhetoric because frankly, that's a lot of what it is. And it's people selling papers. Stuart and his organization, UBCIC, endorsed the old growth strategy in its entirety by resolution. And Stuart, in an article about a month before that came out, said, don't wait and get our permission, just implement these deferrals because it's going to take too long. So, you know, I don't know who's doing what and who's playing what games, but I get a little, I just kind of stop reading all that crap because that's frankly what I think it is. Yeah.
So from your understanding, are the nations being given economical support and options for if they're going to be losing out by accepting the deferral?
I'll give you the Indigenous are in the driver's seat in this for now. The province will at some point, if you have some that are being absolute obstructionists, the province may make the choice, you know what, we can't wait for you to, we can only respect you to a point. We're just going to go ahead and do this. And, you know, that's a political decision that the province, I think, is prepared to make if it really came to it, but they're going to give it the absolute honest try before going there. Is there supports? From what I understand, there is a support program. I really don't know how all that stuff works. What I do know is there is active live conversations with all the First Nations. We have a database or a tracking system for how many have already agreed, how many who have said we'll deal with this in our government to government forum, and they're initiating those conversations. Others have said, yeah, we think we want to talk. And some have actually said no. A few have said no, but we're not taking no as no. We're going over there and saying, why are you saying that? What's the issue here? Can we work this through and can we work it out? Ends up at no, period. Then the government's going to have to make a decision. And I don't know what political decision they'll make. They're trying their hardest to respect both things. One is building the DRIPA relationship that we contemplated in that legislation as a province, and the other is respecting the spirit and intent of this whole old growth, this whole moving to ecosystem management and old growth strategy. So I don't, you know, I may be being a bit evasive on this answer, but it's largely because I don't work in that stuff day to day. But I do know that there is a sustained effort right across the system and numerous tables right now dealing with this, and some are needing some resources. I do know also, though, that some groups are using this as leverage, and we're not going to answer you until we can do a land use plan for our whole territory. And yeah, okay, and you have to pay for that. Well, that's a whole different conversation, and it's not the government isn't going to do that through the whole modernized land use planning process. But let's deal with this deferral right now is the conversation, and what support do you need to make an informed decision and work with us? That is definitely the conversation on the table, and it is happening in many areas where they need to have that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Dave, I have you here.
Yeah, and Dave Hooper here. Just a few comments, Gary. First,
Dave.
hi, how's it going, Gary?
Good.
I mean, I've been involved in this stuff since probably in the early age of Morrison Technical Committee, when we actually tried to protect some of the ecosystems out there, especially the waters, the creeks, the lakes, and put barriers around them. But my frustration over time is, you know, we went from the integrated forest planning, and then went to the 20-year total transplant planning, to the professional alliance that gave minimal guidelines to forest companies. And I mean, at least at the beginning, can't we put some kind of restrictions on how things are done, at least around the water systems, around the ecosystem, water health, that part of it at least. My frustration is when I'm out there, and I've been in the guiding business, my sons are running it now, but since 1979, and I see 1 year logging on one side of the stream, and the next year logging the other side. I mean, it's no wonder we're having flooding and sedimentation, and our salmon stocks are falling. But why can't we put some of these emergency barriers in now? And just one last comment. I don't see us ever being, or forest industry ever being responsible in the land planning unless it is area based, unless the government has total control in handing out where they're going to cut. That's a lot at one time, but I've seen so many problems out there.
It's right now, the only deferrals that are contemplated are the no harvesting in these endangered ecosystems, or irreplaceable ones, because they're just so, we're just dealing with remnants of them right now. In the old growth strategy itself, there has not been contemplation of preservation of integrity of streams, but in the water security strategy, that conversation is coming up and starting to be quite live, of how do we cause business of trying to basically do large scale securing and restoring our watersheds. But let's make sure that we don't start wrecking a bunch more while we're fixing these ones here. And I know that's a live conversation. That's with Ministry of Environment. I need to say something here, is that when Al and I wrote the old growth report, we kind of left it with government. We did a lot of debriefing with them to explain what we meant and how we expected. And, you know, frankly, both of us, we didn't expect to do much more. And then they asked me to come back and work on the technical analysis to build the deferrals package. And I agreed to do that, mostly just to interpret the intent of what we recommended. And then just before Christmas, they asked me to take on this role that I'm doing here today, and doing it with numerous sectors and people in government across the province, of trying to find out what's out there and what people are thinking and what are things we have to think about and work through. So Environment, Ministry of Environment is on my list. I have worked with them on some other things and we have had preliminary, but I don't 100% understand the water security strategy. I do know that a component of it is looking at how do we preserve the ones we have now and not cause damage. But I can't tell you more than that right now, Dave. If you have any contacts in environment, and you can even maybe cycle back to me, because I expect to be talking to them in the next 3 weeks, and I want to really understand this and how it fits in the larger picture. Because if you remember that first slide, it had a big package of all these things. We're not implementing all of those independently. We have to rationalize this whole planning framework and start to blend all these things together into an ecosystem health approach. And even though they were all written separately, they are all pointing to the same direction. And so for me, I really, and a few of us are working now on how do all these things fit together, and how do we make them start talking to each other and working together. Because there's only one land. One of the struggles that government really struggles with getting over this is because they're so siloed, they really have a hard time dealing with land as a whole. But there is only one land. We recognize clearly that we have to start moving to planning it like that and not having this siloed, fractured approach. And so there's a lot of knitting needs to happen, and that is one of the pieces that needs to be knitted in. And that's all I know about it right now. I'll know more probably in 3 weeks or so.
Thank you so much for chiming in, Dave. Brandon.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Good.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering a couple questions. Will predator hunting be taken into consideration when it comes to road closures? I know there's a lot of talk about closing the roads for ecosystems. A lot of us that we base our hunting around predator prey management really need those roads to be open to us to be able to effectively hunt those animals, especially with hounds and whatnot. So I'm just wondering if that's going to be taken into consideration.
Well, you know, I have a bit of a sideways answer for you on this. Where I come from, we practice cubbing. We do some predator management when we get an emergency situation, but the way we manage predators is we go and out of the den in the spring for bears and for wolves. That way you don't destroy the pack dynamic and you don't start creating rogue packs that are lost and confused and start doing weird things. That requires you knowing where these are and doing that on an active basis. Many Indigenous groups practice that before, and my gut tells me that as we move deeper into this, we will start to see that kind of thing happen more as we see the Indigenous voice come in, because it's certainly what we're doing now. And it's what we're doing it on the basis that this is our Aboriginal right. There's a thing with predators, and you probably know this. I know your interest is more from a hunting perspective, but the thing about predators is if you just let predators go, they will kill everything, including you and them, when you live off the land. So historically, our communities didn't have the luxury of being able to go to a grocery store and get groceries when we couldn't get it off the land. You had to get it off the land. And so by necessity, you had to manage predators, because that is the nature of predators. They kill everything, and they get really big. They kill everything until you end up with nothing left in the area. You die off, they die off, and the area goes dead for a long time before it comes back. And so to try to keep it stable, that is the kind of practices that we did. I know other First Nations have different practices. My gut tells me that we're going to start to see a lot more of this in this province as we see more Indigenous involvement. Whether or not it requires access or not, that's another interesting question. You know, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Do you put the access in there and allow all the other impacts just so you can get at the predators? Or, you know, I don't know what the balance is. I have no idea. We never had access when we did it. We just went there, took horses or walked or whatever. Maybe that's not realistic anymore. We all can't walk that far anymore or ride that far. We need a ATV or whatever.
And I think I would have just a candid comment to that. If we consider that we probably have no idea how many resource roads there actually are in this province, but estimates from a couple of years ago is 600,000 kilometers of resource roads. I don't think in this lifetime that we're going to see restoration and rehabilitation of 600,000 kilometers worth of resource roads. So I think there will be resource roads for a few years to come.
Yeah.
Yeah, what we've seen now and what we've been talking with our local biologists on is certain times where there's actually ATV, UTV, motor vehicle ban in those areas for hunting purposes until it comes to predator hunting seasons, so such as lions and bobcats and lynx and stuff like that. And so that might be some kind of idea to be put forward also.
Yeah.
That's a great thought. We're getting close to 9 o'clock. I have Cheryl that's online, and we're going to get close to wrapping up here, gang. Cheryl, are you with us? And thanks, Brandon, for chiming in.
Thanks, Brandon. I appreciate that. I'm really glad you brought it up too.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Nope. I was going to see if you were like Thomas. Well, oh, how come you can't?
You never know. Technology, the bane of our existence, right?
Drives you nuts.
You.
Yeah.
Thank you, Gary, for such an informative and enlightening presentation. And a big thanks to Hunters for BC SCI for hosting. I mean, this has just been so enlightening and informative. And, you know, I come from a forest-dependent family in the interior and a forest-dependent community that also experienced devastating flooding a couple of years ago, of course, Grand Forks. And so I totally get, you know, that we need to make that paradigm shift and that there needs to be a balance between the environment and the economy. And, you know, your comment about the fact that forestry in BC is akin to oil and gas in Alberta, you know, that really resonates with a lot of us, right? And the fact that, you know, we built an industry bigger than we should have, and it's not sustainable in the long run. So I was really interested in when I had the opportunity to review your very informative report. One of your key observations was to create greater certainty for forest-dependent communities, and there's a lot of them in our province, right? By generating more sustainable and long-term non-timber economic benefits from old forest. And so I was just curious as to what you and Al, what your vision was for this in terms of the non-timber economic benefits.
You know what? We saw a number of economic analyses that told us, you know, the funny thing is in this province, we have this idea that a timber job is somehow worth 30 other jobs, in spite of the fact that sometimes 30 other families are sustained by those maybe lesser paying jobs, but nonetheless important in sustaining families. But we saw a lot of analysis on the impact on other sectors from our current way of doing forestry. Nobody's opposed to the forestry that in this province. It's how we're doing it that's the issue. It's not that we're doing it. And so first off, I don't know who in their right mind could think that dropping from our current cut levels, we're going to see some AACs in this province and some TSAs drop by 50% in this next round. And we're going to see that drop, a steep decline in AACs, annual allowable cuts, for a little while, and quite a few TSAs where we've way over harvested. And we're going to go down to probably a third of what we are currently harvesting even today. And we're going to stay at that for 30 or 40 years. And then as our second growth starts coming on stream, we'll be able to lift it up and be able to get to a long-term kind of sustainable number. I don't know who in their right mind could think that's sustainable in terms of an economy. All that's doing is, frankly, I feel like it's being a bit selfish, that we're valuing our jobs today more than our kids and grandkids' ability to have a life in this sector. That's what I feel like we're doing. And I just really feel like it's selfish in a way. And that is a chronic problem across in quite a few areas in this province right now, that we've backed ourselves into a really tight corner. What does that look like? You know, I wish I knew. We heard a lot of different visions from different communities around the province about where they would like to go. Every single one of them included an industrial or a forestry, a timber and products component in it. It just wasn't the kind of heavy duty industrial model that we see right now. In most cases, wasn't that. But it included a lot of other value-added forest activities, wildcrafting, wilderness experiences, selling our turns out, you know, forestry used to have the biggest GDP and contributor to the provincial economy, and right now I think it's like 15th or something. And tourism has outstripped it by miles for quite a while. And BC sells Supernatural BC. That's our brand. And there's places where we have heard firsthand where people have seen significant changes in their international clientele because they get here and what they see is a lot different than the pictures that they see in the brochures on the ground. And so we're seeing a hit on that. And that really, so, you know, I don't know what it is locally. I've heard a lot of great ideas. One of our recommendations in the old growth report was many communities said to us, we can figure this out if we get support, the proper planning support and the proper transition support. We can re-envision ourselves and rebuild ourselves. And so one of our recommendations is to support these forest sector workers and these forest dependent communities as they transition and revisualize themselves. You know, I look at Revelstoke. Revelstoke reshaped itself completely into a whole different kind of place, and so have a few other towns in this province, and some just died. I don't know if I don't know what the answer, I frankly don't know, because it really is a local thing. I know that this is something that rural development in the province is now becoming engaged with and looking at all kinds of options on how do we build a different kind of more stable long-term economies that don't fluctuate and cycle all over like this. But I don't know if that's even possible given the world that we live in with COVID and everything else too. But I know that's a really vague answer. I guess the short answer is local communities need to figure that out for themselves, and it will probably continue to include a forestry and timber component in those communities where it already exists. How's that?
Great answer.
Fair enough.
Thanks so much for joining us, Cheryl.
Thanks.
Okay, Neil, are you back online?
Yeah, so I think we're pretty much going to have to cut it off here, you guys. It's 2 hours, and really appreciate it. It's a very interesting mix of comments that we had. A lot of members of the organization and non-members, and that's exciting for me to see, and I'm sure for the rest of us. I think we have a few questions that are left over that we'll have to follow up with, perhaps by email correspondence, or you and I can talk about that, perhaps Amberly and with Garry. And I think there's enough response here that maybe we'll do this again at some point soon. I just find this to be very compelling, and I think a lot of people there's a few people that want to have some more input in this. So till next time, perhaps. And Garry, greatly appreciate it, and Amberly for your help tonight organizing this. And sorry about my technical difficulties at my end, but I know this was very informative, and I was quite impressed by the response that we've had. So well done, and we will convene this again maybe in the next couple months.
Yes, Garry, I don't think that we will be shy on reaching out to you again. And you know, every time, this is my third time meeting you this way, and I'm always just impressed and overwhelmed and mostly hopeful. So yeah, it's great to get informed. And there's a few people that we didn't make it to with questions. I've reached out to them all. I will be following up with everybody tomorrow with the questions that we didn't get answered. We decided at 9 o'clock that, you know, we were stretching it pretty good, but we won't forget.
Thank you very much, Garry.
Okay.
I'm gonna go have a beer and visit my wife now.
There you go. Excellent.
That's perfect.
Nothing
Thanks
against
again,
you
everybody.
guys.
We'll do this again. Garry, I'll be in touch with you.
Thank you, everybody.
So much.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
See
Good
ya.
night.